What if the biggest threat to Prince Harry right now isn't the tabloids, but his own story falling apart in public? He walked into a London courtroom expecting justice, vindication, and moral victory. Instead, he's watching his case unravel, his allies disappear, and his credibility come under fire, live in front of the world. Prince Harry now finds himself on increasingly unstable ground, and what once appeared to be a bold, confident legal crusade against the British tabloids is rapidly unraveling in full public view. His confrontation with the UK press, most notably with Associated Newspapers Limited, the publisher of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, has drifted far from the moral stand he originally presented. What was framed as a principled fight for accountability and justice has increasingly morphed into a highly charged public spectacle. Harry has consistently argued that these tabloids illegally gathered information about him, positioning himself as a victim of systematic abuse. Yet as the trial progresses, that narrative appears less solid, more strained, and increasingly vulnerable to challenge. The first unmistakable sign that the case was in trouble came with the sudden resignation of key members of Harry's legal team. This was not a minor staffing adjustment or an administrative reshuffle carried out behind closed doors. It had the unmistakable weight of a strategic withdrawal, the kind that suggests those closest to the case recognized serious structural weaknesses. When senior lawyers step away in the middle of proceedings, it is almost never accidental. According to insiders, the move reflected not confidence but concern, a tacit acknowledgement that the case was losing momentum and credibility as it came under sustained scrutiny. That loss of stability became glaringly apparent once the trial entered its most confrontational phase. Harry arrived in court armed with sweeping accusations, alleging illegal surveillance, coordinated conspiracies, and deliberate targeting by sections of the British press. The claims were broad, emotionally charged, and framed as part of a long-running pattern of persecution. The defense, however, did not respond in kind with general denials. Instead, they narrowed the focus with surgical precision, redirecting attention away from abstract allegations and toward specific relationships, documented interactions, and Harry's own past behavior. What unfolded was not merely a rebuttal of evidence, but a direct and unsettling challenge to Harry's personal version of events. At the heart of the defense's strategy was the reframing of two journalists, Rebecca English of the Daily Mail and Katie Nishaw, as professionals doing their jobs rather than criminals engaged in unlawful conduct. Harry's legal argument portrayed them as active participants in illegal information gathering, yet Associated Newspapers countered with a far more nuanced and uncomfortable portrayal. Their position was that Harry was not simply a passive target of media intrusion, but someone who understood the workings of the press, navigated that world knowingly, and, at times, engaged with it to his own advantage. The defense placed particular emphasis on Katie Nishaw's relationship with Harry. Nishaw, a former diary editor for the Mail on Sunday and a familiar figure in television commentary, was depicted by Harry's side as someone who crossed legal boundaries in pursuit of information. The defense, however, painted a starkly different picture. According to their account, Nishaw was not covertly tracking Harry, but was personally invited by him to a private party in 2011 at Kensington Roof Gardens. They further argued that the two continued to circulate within the same elite social circles afterward, maintaining a level of familiarity that contradicts the idea of a hostile or predatory dynamic. When Nishaw reportedly responded to Harry's accusations by stating plainly that he had invited her himself, it dealt a significant blow to his portrayal of events. The implication of voluntary contact and social familiarity complicated the image of unilateral victimhood and introduced uncomfortable questions about selective memory and motive. A similarly destabilizing pattern emerged in the case involving Rebecca English. Harry's legal team highlighted an email from 2010 in which English allegedly sought flight details related to Harry's then-girlfriend, Chelsea Davy, from a private jet company. This was presented as evidence of illicit information gathering and unethical journalistic behavior. The defense, however, dismissed the claim as speculative, arguing that the email itself demonstrated no illegal activity. They emphasized English's long-standing career as a respected royal correspondent, her professional access during Harry's years as a working royal, and her reliance on conventional journalistic methods. In their view, the email was consistent with standard reporting practices rather than proof of CR. Immoral conduct. Taken together, these developments proved deeply damaging to Harry's case. The journalists he accused increasingly appeared human, credible, and professionally grounded, while Harry himself began to look less like a wronged individual seeking justice and more like someone pursuing a deeply personal grievance. The boundary between criminal misconduct and ordinary journalism grew increasingly blurred, and the courtroom atmosphere shifted accordingly. What was once positioned as a moral reckoning began to resemble something else entirely. A slow, methodical dismantling of Harry's credibility, carried out not through grand declarations, but through detail, context, and contradiction. The emotional toll on Prince Harry has become increasingly visible as the trial grinds on, impossible to disguise and impossible to ignore. Observers inside the courtroom have noted how markedly changed he appears, his face drawn, his posture heavy, his movements slower, as though the cumulative weight of the proceedings is pressing down on him. The strain shows not just in fleeting expressions, but in the way he carries himself, as if each day in court further erodes the confidence with which he once entered this fight. What was meant to be a moment of moral clarity now looks emotionally exhausting, even punishing. The irony is unmistakable. After years spent condemning media intrusion and the corrosive effects of public scrutiny, Harry now finds himself subjected to an even more intense spotlight, with global audiences watching his every gesture as he attempts to dismantle the reputations of the journalists he says caused him such harm. That sense of collapse deepened dramatically with the resignation of key members of his legal team, an event that sent shockwaves through both legal and media circles. Experienced analysts were quick to point out that such departures rarely occur without profound underlying issues. Lawyers do not abandon high-profile cases lightly, especially in the middle of a trial. When they do, it often signals that a client's instructions have become legally untenable, strategically unsound, or impossible to reconcile with the available evidence. In Harry's case, the resignations appeared less like a disagreement over tactics and more like a rejection of the story he was asking them to defend. The implication was stark and deeply damaging. The people closest to the case may no longer believe his narrative can withstand serious scrutiny. For Harry, this lawsuit was never intended to be a narrow legal dispute. It was supposed to stand as a defining chapter in his post-royal life, a cornerstone of the broader campaign he and Meghan Markle launched against the British media establishment. From the beginning, the case was framed as a moral battle, a clear struggle between right and wrong, victim and oppressor. Harry positioned himself not merely as a claimant seeking damages, but as a symbol of resistance against what he described as a toxic press culture. Yet as the case falters, the risks extend far beyond the courtroom. A defeat here threatens to unravel that carefully constructed image, reinforcing perceptions that he is overly combative, thin-skinned, and unable to distinguish between genuine wrongdoing and criticism that simply makes him uncomfortable. The financial stakes only heighten the pressure. A loss could leave Harry facing enormous legal bills, compounding the emotional and reputational damage already accumulating. These costs are not trivial. They represent a tangible reminder that this crusade carries real-world consequences. Still, the greater danger lies in the symbolic fallout. This trial has evolved into a referendum on Harry himself, on his judgment, his credibility, and his relationship with the truth. Increasingly, it appears less like a quest for justice and more like a deeply personal reckoning, driven by resentment and unresolved anger rather than clear, provable harm. As Harry's position grows more precarious, the journalists at the center of the controversy are emerging in a surprisingly sympathetic light. Katie Nischel, a cancer survivor, and Rebecca English, a veteran royal correspondent with years of professional experience, are no longer presented as faceless agents of a hostile media machine. Instead, they appear as individuals defending their reputations and livelihoods. Both have pushed back firmly against Harry's claims, arguing that he is selectively reshaping the past to suit his present narrative. They contend that long-standing professional interactions are being reframed as malicious acts, transforming ordinary journalistic conduct into alleged persecution. As the trial progresses, the focus has shifted decisively away from what may have happened a decade ago and toward a more immediate question: how reliable is Harry's account of his own history? That shift is mirrored unmistakably in Harry's demeanor in court. The man who once projected defiance and certain, why now appears diminished, drained, and emotionally overwhelmed. The moment he envisioned as vindication, the chance to finally confront the tabloids and emerge morally triumphant, has begun to feel closer to humiliation. His expressions suggest frustration and disbelief, as though he is struggling to reconcile the outcome he expected with the reality unfolding before him. Rather than reclaiming control of his narrative, he appears to be losing it piece by piece, under the relentless pressure of cross-examination and public scrutiny. Compounding this sense of isolation is the conspicuous absence of Meghan. While Harry endures the trial in London, Meghan remains in Montecito, offering no visible public support. There are no courtroom appearances, no shared walks, no symbolic gestures of unity that might reinforce the us against the world image they once carefully cultivated. For a couple who built much of their public identity around mutual solidarity and shared struggle, her absence is striking. It suggests a widening distance, whether emotional, strategic, or both, and leaves Harry standing alone in a battle he once framed as a fight to protect his family. Instead of appearing as half of a united front, he now looks solitary, exposed, and increasingly burdened by the consequences of a war he chose to wage. Sources close to the proceedings describe the atmosphere surrounding Prince Harry as profoundly heavy and emotionally draining, a space thick with tension and quiet despair. Those who have observed him closely speak of a man carrying an almost visible weight, as though the gravity of the situation presses down on him at every moment. The resignation of key members of his legal team landed not merely as a procedural development, but as a psychological blow, one that felt unmistakably like a vote of no confidence. It left Harry exposed in ways that go far beyond legal vulnerability. Without the steady presence of trusted advisors who once stood firmly beside him, he now appears emotionally unanchored, confronting the process largely on his own. His visible distress in court seems to arise from something deeper than aggressive questioning or the pressure of testimony. It reflects the slow, painful experience of watching a carefully constructed identity, his self-image as a persecuted truth-teller and moral crusader, come under sustained, methodical assault. As the testimony has unfolded, Harry's narrative has not simply been questioned. It has been fundamentally complicated, perhaps beyond repair. Accounts of social invitations, overlapping social circles, and moments of mutual engagement with members of the media have reshaped the story he brought into the courtroom. Rather than appearing solely as a passive target of journalistic intrusion, he is increasingly portrayed as someone who understood the system, navigated it, and at times participated in it. That reframing is deeply destabilizing. To have one's past publicly dissected and reinterpreted, stripped of emotional framing, and examined through evidence, context, and contradiction, is profoundly unsettling. Harry is no longer fighting only a powerful media corporation. He is confronting a revised version of his own history. And that confrontation, playing out under oath and under intense public scrutiny, appears to be slipping steadily out of his control. The trial has also exposed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Harry's post-royal life. Together with Meghan, he built a powerful and lucrative media presence by monetizing their personal story. Their experiences, grievances, and emotional truths were transformed into books, documentaries, interviews, and high-profile media projects. Their narrative became not just personal expression, but a brand. Yet when the most consequential legal chapter of that story is being written, when claims are tested not by public sympathy, but by evidence and cross-examination, Harry stands alone. Meghan's absence feels deliberate, even strategic, a calculated distancing from a fight that carries the risk of public and legal failure. The contrast is striking. A shared story sold globally, but a solitary reckoning when that story is put on trial. The emotional impact on Harry is undeniable and increasingly difficult to conceal. His posture often appears slumped, as though the energy that once animated him has been steadily drained. His gaze frequently seems distant, unfocused, hinting at a man caught in an internal struggle as much as a legal one. The defiant energy that once defined him, the certainty, the willingness to confront critics head-on, the confidence that he was unquestionably right, has largely evaporated. In its place is a man suspended between two identities. On one side stands the royal world he left behind, which he has repeatedly described as rejecting and misunderstanding him. On the other is the independent life he built, a new reality that now seems unable or unwilling to offer the support he needs at this critical moment. The California dream that once symbolized freedom, reinvention, and emotional safety feels distant as he faces this reckoning alone in London. At its core, Harry's visible misery reflects a deeper and more consequential strategic failure. He attempted to transplant the dynamics of royal media warfare into a courtroom environment. In the royal sphere, carefully crafted statements, emotional appeals, and sympathetic coverage can shape public opinion and influence perception. Narrative, in that context, is power, but a court of law is indifferent to narrative. It does not respond to moral framing, personal pain, or public sentiment. It operates on evidence, cross-examination, and verifiable facts. In this setting, publicity offers no shield, and personal confession carries no inherent authority. The very tools that once allowed Harry to control his story in the public arena are proving ineffective and even damaging under judicial scrutiny. Meghan, often described as the architect of their broader media strategy, is absent because there is, in many ways, no strategy left to deploy. There are no optics to manage, no narrative pivots that can override testimony or legal standards. What remains is a fragile case subjected to relentless examination. The courtroom itself amplifies the psychological pressure. The judge's impassive presence, the press gallery recording every expression, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion, and the conspicuously empty seat beside Harry where his partner might have been. Together, these elements converge into a crushing emotional weight. Harry may have entered this battle believing he was prepared to fight for justice, convinced that moral certainty and personal conviction would carry him through. Instead, he now appears increasingly isolated, burdened by the realization that narrative power dissolves quickly when confronted by the unforgiving mechanics of the law. What began as a quest for vindication has turned into a public and deeply personal reckoning, one in which Harry is forced not only to defend his claims, but to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the story he has told himself and sold to the world may no longer be enough to save him. Harry wanted to be seen as a warrior for justice, a figure of moral resolve standing bravely against a powerful and allegedly abusive media system. In his own mind, this was meant to be a defining stand, a moment where truth would finally overpower distortion, and where his long-running grievances would be validated in the most public and authoritative setting possible. Instead, what has emerged is a far more unsettling image. He appears stranded, isolated, and increasingly alone, a man who marched into battle expecting allies behind him, only to discover that many have quietly withdrawn. The fortress he believed would shield him, constructed from public sympathy, emotional storytelling, and moral certainty, has proven to be alarmingly fragile. Rather than offering protection, it has exposed him. His suffering at this point is no longer merely personal or circumstantial. It is the inevitable consequence of a campaign that mistook attention for power, visibility for leverage, and narrative dominance for actual control. In a court of law, where facts outweigh feelings and evidence trumps emotion, neither publicity nor personal conviction is enough to prevail. When one steps back from the dense legal arguments and the familiar royal intrigue, this entire episode begins to look like a broader cautionary tale for public figures navigating the modern media landscape. Harry's approach reflects an outdated assumption that loudly invoking privacy violations will automatically secure public sympathy and moral high ground. That assumption no longer holds. Today's audiences are far more discerning and far less patient. They scrutinize inconsistencies, question motives, and recognize when outrage appears selective. In an era of constant access and oversharing, people are acutely aware of contradictions, especially when a man who condemns press intrusion has simultaneously earned millions by publicly selling the most intimate details of his life through books, documentaries, and televised interviews. The public is no longer inclined to suspend disbelief simply because the claimant is famous or royal. The irony at the heart of this case is impossible to ignore and increasingly difficult to defend. Harry is suing tabloids for invading his privacy while, at the same time, profiting handsomely from exposure. He demands accountability from the media while actively using that same media ecosystem to generate wealth, influence, and relevance. He condemns intrusion while monetizing confession. This contradiction does not merely weaken his legal position, it corrodes trust at a fundamental level. It creates the impression of selective boundaries, privacy when convenient, transparency when profitable. And once trust erodes, sympathy inevita. Blythe follows. The public begins to disengage, not out of cruelty, but out of fatigue. The absence of Meghan Markle only sharpens that perception. For years, Harry and Meghan carefully cultivated an image of unity, a power couple bound together against hostile forces, presenting themselves as unwavering allies in a shared struggle. But when the pressure reached its peak, when the consequences became most severe, one half of that partnership was conspicuously missing. Rather than projecting solidarity, the silence suggests calculation, distance, and perhaps a conscious effort to avoid collateral damage. The lack of visible support undermines the narrative they once curated so meticulously, raising uncomfortable questions about what unity looks like when the stakes are highest and the outcome uncertain. Ultimately, Harry appears to have lost control of the story he once shaped so confidently. The narrative he spent years building, carefully framed, emotionally charged, and repeatedly reinforced, has slipped from his grasp. Public sympathy, once abundant, has thinned, and in many quarters evaporated altogether, replaced by skepticism and weariness. The departure of his legal team signals more than a technical or procedural setback. It represents a public relations disaster of the highest order. It implies that even those professionally obligated to advocate for his position may no longer see a viable path forward. While the tabloids themselves remain far from innocent, often aggressive, invasive, and unapologetically ruthless, Harry's strategy has backfired. He is not reforming the system. He is not changing the culture. He is not winning hearts or minds. Instead, he has become the story, and not in the way he intended. What makes this outcome especially striking is that it was never inevitable. Harry had alternatives at every stage. He could have ignored the tabloids, depriving them of attention and oxygen. He could have redirected his energy toward charitable work, advocacy, and building a quieter, more grounded life away from constant confrontation. He could have chosen restraint over escalation, distance over warfare, but he did not. He chose confrontation, repeatedly and publicly, believing that persistence would eventually yield vindication. Now, He is facing the cumulative consequences of that choice, financially, emotionally, and reputationally. The situation serves as a stark reminder that fame and wealth do not guarantee peace, and that relentless conflict rarely produces the closure one seeks. Yet despite everything, Harry appears unable to let go. Driven by a deep and consuming need to prove himself right, to validate his version of events beyond doubt, he continues forward even as the cost grows steeper and the odds diminish. At this stage, public sympathy is difficult to summon, not because his pain is unreal, but because the path that led him here was paved by conscious, repeated decisions. This was not an accident. It was a trajectory. He chose it step by step. And so he sits alone in a wood-paneled London courtroom, under the unblinking gaze of the world, watching the narrative he once controlled slowly unravel. What began as a quest for justice now feels like an epic failure unfolding in slow motion, a cautionary drama about ego, expectation, and miscalculation. It is a crisis of his own making, marked not by sudden collapse but by gradual exposure, with no clear exit and no easy redemption in sight. So here we are. Prince Harry sits alone in a wood-paneled London courtroom, under the unblinking gaze of the world, watching the narrative he once controlled slowly unravel. What began as a crusade for justice now looks like a slow-motion collapse, part legal battle, part image crisis, part personal reckoning, with no easy exit. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Harry is fighting for justice, or fighting to hold on to control? If you made it to the end, hit the like button so this conversation reaches more people. Subscribe for deeper breakdowns like this, and comment below with your take, because your perspective is what shapes the next story we cover.